Pretty close. Okay. K. L. M. N. O. Our Francophone people, not Uganda. O. P. Q. Direct flights to Qatar. R. S. Well represented. T. U. V. W. Aha. X. Y. Z. Well done. Well done. Please, a round of applause for yourselves. My name is George Ndirango. I'll be your host and moderator for the day. We have only 1 hour. So that means for everyone coming to speak, please, extremely concise and extremely precise. Africa is right at its cusp in its economic trajectory. We're well aware of the continent's resources. We've talked about the continent's population. We've talked. You guys have been at summits. We're well aware of the continent's potential. So much of what is being discussed is not new. We, however, have a consistency and sustainability concern because of our financial needs as Africa. As we speak, there's still heavy reliance on governments, of course, to fund some of the projects that we're doing country to country. Even for the intergovernmental bodies and those that are supporting the countries, there's still a lot of reliance on governments. It's crucial to have alternative avenues to get that cash injection, primarily from the private sector. And don't forget, our needs as countries keeps changing and they keep growing. And that's why we're here today. AFDB has played a crucial role in bringing all the stakeholders together. You can see them on the poster here. You'll hear reference of the Africa Club and AAMFI. Don't get confused, they're all the same. The Africa Club, as we'll hear with our opening remarks, is made up of the Africa Finance Corporation, the African Export-Import Bank, the Trade and Development Bank Group, TDB Group, African Reinsurance Corporation, African Trade and Investment Development Insurance, Shelter Afrique Development Bank, and ZEPRI, PTA Reinsurance Company, all of whom we'll hear from within the 1 hour that we're here. Within that same breath, we'd like to make sure that the session is as fruitful and energized as possible. So we'll have 2 opening remarks, and then we'll get into a quick, in-depth discussion with some of our special guests who are in the room now. So, are we good to go? Just give me a thumbs up if we're all on the same page. Thumbs up? We won't start. Please, thumbs up. Fantastic. All right. Our first speaker, Professor Benedict Orama, is the President and Chairman of the Board of Directors of Afrexim Bank and Chairperson of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, AAMFI, which we are calling the Africa Club. Please, let's give a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, the MC. Your Excellency, Dr. Kubmi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, represented here by Vice President. Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, the Commissioner for Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry, and Minerals of the African Union Commission. Honorable Ministers and ambassadors here present, our colleagues, the heads of African multilateral financial institutions, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'm privileged and honored to have the opportunity to address you on this important occasion. Allow me to first of all congratulate His Excellency Dr. Kubmi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, and his team on what we are certain will be a successful annual general meeting of the Board of Directors of the African Development Bank Group here in Nairobi. That could mark yet another successful year for the African Development Bank, a pioneer institution that has become a systemic part of the global development finance landscape and a key pillar of the continent's development journey. Allow me to also thank President Adesina and his team for graciously agreeing to host this side event at the annual meetings. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, this event is organized by the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions, also called the Africa Club. The alliance was launched by African heads of state on the margins of the 37th Ordinary Session of the Assembly of the Heads of State and Governments of the African Union on the 17th of February this year in Addis Ababa. The key purpose was to create a platform for all of us, the African multilateral financial institutions, to work more closely together towards the attainment of our common mandate. We look up to the African Development Bank as our guide and pillar of support in this effort. The alliance is made up of African multilateral financial institutions, which are institutions set up by treaty by African states, also controlled by African states, in response to the inadequacies of the existing global and continental financial architecture. The members of the alliance include today the African Finance Corporation, the African Export-Import Bank, Trinidad Development Bank Group, African Insurance Corporation, Africa Trade and Investment Development Insurance, and ZEPRI, the PTA Insurance Company. We also have a number of our other colleagues who have an application in the process to join. These institutions have matured over the decades with a collective balance sheet of about $65 billion deployed specifically to address the critical trade and investment gaps across the continent. I must point out that the African Development Bank was a key player in the creation of some of the African multilateral financial institutions who are members of the alliance, including the establishment of a Afrexim Bank, which was championed by the ADB. In addition, the African Development Bank is a key contributor of capital and major shareholder holding institutional board seats in several of these multilateral financial institutions, including a Afrexim Bank, a TD, the TDB, and others. In addition, these African multilateral financial institutions already collaborate with the African Development Bank on a broad range of financing and development initiatives across the continent, serving complementary roles in financing the continent's development and also supporting the activities of the private sector. In this regard, the Alliance hopes to further expand the scope of collaboration with the African Development Bank in fostering African capital to finance strategic projects and initiatives under the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, the Alliance's formation underscores the collective commitment of its members to support Africa's self-reliance and sustainable economic development, leveraging homegrown solutions and resources for the continent's transformation. The Alliance aims to deepen collaborative efforts to address Africa's development and finance needs, promote the interests of member states, advocate for Africa and global finance issues, support sustainable finance strategies, and play a key role in debt management negotiations that our countries go through. It also aims to develop innovative financial solutions to support the business and economic activities of the African private sector, including the pooling of capital and expertise to finance cross-border infrastructure development projects that will facilitate inter-African trade and support the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. It is therefore befitting that the theme of today's event is on the mobilization of finance for the development of the African private sector. Your Excellencies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to end on this note and thank you for your kind attention as we engage in the discussions on mobilizing finance for private sector development in Africa. I wish us an engaging and interactive session. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Let's keep it going. Please welcome to the stage His Excellency Ambassador Albert Muchanga, Commissioner for Trade and Industry at the AU Commission.
Thank you very much, Director of Ceremony. As you are giving us the examination before the start of this session, I was wondering if you were going to give us diplomas or degrees. Now, I'll write on the salutations of my brother, the chairman of the board and president of the African Development Bank. I'll simply remove my name and say all protocols observed. If you look at the theme of this year for the African Development Bank, Africa's transformation, the African Development Bank Group, and the reform of the global financial architecture. There is very, very clear. We have the duty to transform Africa into an economy that is prosperous, in an economy that ensures that everybody, every African, benefits from the process of inclusive growth and sustainable development. And when you look at the African Development Bank Group, we can make it broader by bringing all the Pan-African multilateral development banks and other financial institutions and indicate that finance is key to Africa's transformation. And when you look at the reform of the global financial architecture, it's also very, very clear that for Africa to transform, we need a conducive continental environment, and we also need a conducive global environment. So the issue of global financial architecture is a key aspect of the G20. And Africa is now a permanent member of the G20. We have a working group, which is called the Working Group on the International Financial Architecture. And the question of reform of the global financial architecture is very, very key there. And the African Development Bank is very active, like all other multilateral development finance institutions across the world. So it's a very, very timely theme. And then we look at the title of this event this afternoon, Mobilizing Finance for Private Sector Development in Africa. And here the message is very key. If Africa has to transform, we have to find ways of enabling the private sector to contribute. And as they contribute, they must have a return on investment. So the policies and regulations that governments come out with should be conducive to the participation of the private sector in Africa's transformation. And all over the world, governments are realizing that public finances are not enough. We need to bring in the private sector. And in the African situation, I could not recall the figure now, Because one of the problems I face is that I'm running from speech to speech, and I end up giving wrong figures. But the fact of the matter is that in a given year, a lot of money that belongs to the African private sector, just like the money which belongs to the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, the mutual funds, is held abroad. It's not being invested in Africa. The question, high returns but high risk. So how do we create a playing field where we ensure that the private sector should have confidence in investing in Africa and their money will be safe? Those are the ideas that we look forward to you giving us this afternoon. But as I listen, let me also share with you that the African Union is also contributing to mobilizing private sector resources across the continent. One of the activities we have come up with is the establishment of a Pan-African stock exchange. It's going to be a virtual platform. Right now, work is underway to see how it is going to work, and about 9 countries have joined, but we hope that over time it's going to spread throughout the continent. And another mechanism we are coming up is operationalization of the African credit rating agency. For it to work, the rating agents should be undertaking ratings across Africa. And for it to do ratings across Africa, we should have an African capital market. And the Africa Club is a contributor to the development of the African capital market. So, let us transform Africa. Let us mobilize funds, finances from the private sector to transform Africa. Let us build an African capital market. That way, we shall create the Africa we want. Just before the speech, 2 of my colleagues I was seated with said, Africa is resting on potential. We don't have means of transforming that potential into achieving what we want. I like the private sector to play a critical role in Africa's development. What are we going to do to ensure that it does that? That's a question I pose to you, and I rest my case. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. Okay, so let's keep it going. We'd like to have the panel discussion now. When I call you on stage, please kindly join us. Samaila Zubairu, President and CEO of the Africa Finance Corporation and first Vice Chairperson of the Alliance of African Multilateral Financial Institutions. Anyway. Okay. Admasu Tadese, Group President and Managing Director, Trade and Development Bank Group. Hope Morera, Managing Director and CEO at ZEPRI, PTA Reinsurance Corporation. Tiaruno Habib Han, CEO and Managing Director, Shelter Afrique Development Bank. Manuel Moses, CEO African Trade and Investment Development Insurance. And Dr. James Mwangi, Group Managing Director and Group CEO of Equity Bank Limited Group Holdings Limited. Okay. Dear panelists, Dr. James, okay. We've made an agreement. We'll make it precise and concise. Yes? Fantastic. All right. Samaila, we'll start off with you. We've been to 1 million of these. Even when I started my journalism career ages ago, we sat with you on a panel. So we've been to many of these. Nothing is new. But let's discuss some crucial issues. Some financing structures on the continent are very complex. We are talking about a system that starts from payment in cash, payment to merchants, payment by card, trade development bank. So very complex. But we're discussing the almost where the value chain starts. Please just give us very precise and concise partnerships that you've seen work that will then guide even as we continue with this Africa Club.
Thank you very much for that. And again, I want to acknowledge African Development Bank for hosting us and co-convening with us. And of course, our chairperson, Professor Rama, and His Excellency for their very wonderful remarks. So I think that the way to make this very relevant, I'll just tell you a just very short story. 20 years ago, I used to be the treasurer for Dangote Group, and we wanted to build a large cement plant. It was $1 billion. And it took us something like 2 years to be able to mobilize $480 million. As soon as that plant was commissioned, we were going to launch the expansion program that was going to take us to 2 other African countries. And we raised $1.6 billion in 2 months. See the difference. Now, we were able to raise that $1.6 billion in 2 months because, one, the plant that we built was already operational and we could generate $400 million from within. And it was easy to raise $1.6 billion from Nigerian financial institutions. This just gives you an example of what strong financial institutions mean and the impact they can make. So how do we do this? What kind of partnership works? The partnerships that work is a realization that we must unlock, retain, and capture value on the continent by moving away from exporting raw materials to finished goods and processed goods. If we continue selling raw materials, we will perpetually be poor. There will be no savings that we can generate. We would never realize our potential. Once we can move through import substitution, through primary industry, through primary processing, to unlock and structurally transform our economies, we build the base, we create quality jobs that we can mobilize as savings in the economy. On the back of the institutional savings that we're able to mobilize, we can build capital markets that allow us to de-risk opportunities. And on the back of that, we can accelerate through further growth of the economies. So the way to do it is very simple. First, we must unlock, capture, and retain value on the continent. The second thing, as we do that, we create quality jobs and we create savings, which we must save to reinvest in further industrialization of the continent, educating our people, enhancing the quality of our human capital, and building deliberate research institutions that allow us to build capital markets, allow us to further transform our economies. And then on the back of that, we would see far more growth. We would see the partnerships that we're required to do. Now, one final point is we all talk about the African potential and how we're going to be the workforce of the world. We have to do something about it. It's not going to happen by itself. We have to invest on education and training and technology for our people. So we've seen the Asian miracle. We've seen several things. What we need to do is to workshop what has happened in those economies. We don't need to have their journey. We should workshop how we can quickly intervene to make things possible. Now, we all know, and it's been just reminded to us here, that we need private capital for growth. And we need to demonstrate that Africa is indeed a viable proposition. I dare say the very existence of African Finance Corporation, our growth in the last 17 years, demonstrate that Africa is indeed a viable proposition. And all the opportunities that we have for the energy transition, the Africa being a key part of the solution for the poly crisis, further demonstrate the fact that Africa is indeed a viable investment destination. We just need to do the work. And just to kind of make it clear for people that don't know, so we started with 1.1 billion 17 years ago. The capital is now 3.5 billion with total assets of 12.5 billion. So if we're not profitable and we're not doing well, we will not have this growth. And this growth is really nothing compared to what the potential is. Literally nothing. Because if you understand that Africa has 10,000 gigawatts of solar energy potential, 110 gigawatts of wind energy potential, 400 gigawatts of gas thermal potential, 15 gigawatts of geothermal, 350 gigawatts of hydro, and the fact that in all of these places, the highest that we've gotten to is probably about 8 or 9%. So the potential is there. And then, of course, the future of the world is electric. And all the battery value minerals are all in Africa. So just transforming this with the renewable energy that we have on the continent is significant potential that is avenue for us to mobilize capital to develop the continent.
Right.
So again, just to summarize, we need to sit down together, workshop and learn from what people have done to be successful. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. We need to just look at how do we create the blend of government intervention and private capital to develop the continent.
Thank you very much. Hope, let's come to you, because Samaila has alluded to something on risk, even on the macro level. But when we're working towards mitigating risk for investors in African private sector projects, we are slowly starting to move away from young people are risky, women are risky, and we are working on that as we move along. But help us reconcile within the macro and micro level so that we don't leave anyone behind, even as we attract as much as possible.
Thank you very much. So we talk about insurance and reinsurance being the unsung heroes, right? We are nearly always just criticized. But if you think about it, even at the macro level, or the major investments that happen in countries, in Kenya, SGR, Nairobi Expressway, that is actually behind the cover of insurance companies and reinsurance companies. So it is an existing participant and actor at every level. If you now move down further to, I should also talk about the airport, right? The Nairobi airport, the JKIA, when it got banned 10 or so years ago. Insurance funds, reinsurance funds got that activated very, very quickly. And you can imagine the losses, economic and otherwise, that would have happened. But going down now, we're talking about inclusion. How do we make sure that more people are included? And therefore, participating in what we're talking about, private sector capital raising. So if you think about today, the biggest investors, the biggest depositors in banks, financial institutions, it's insurance companies. Rather than pensions, you have insurance companies. So already there is work being done by this sector to mobilize funds from individuals, private sector, that goes into the development. Can we do more? Definitely, we can do a lot. With what we are seeing, the wars, the debt crisis, the inflation, whatever is happening, there is a big sector of our economy, the SMEs, that are being totally decimated. And we see the sector, the insurance sector, as coming in to bridge that, to de-risk that sector. And currently, happy to report as members of AAMFI ourselves and TD, together with IFC and the World Bank, we are looking at how do we actually come together to de-risk, to provide packages that de-risk the SMEs. We are very involved with the other members, Shelter Freak, TDB, Afrexim, on how do we de-risk the trade and investments that they are making. So there is, we are acting at very different levels. Most importantly, though, with the climate risks and what we are seeing, we've come through to say, how do we actually de-risk the most vulnerable? And there's a lot going on, and a lot that can be done. Through DRIVE, which is our flagship project, the de-risking and value enhancement for the pastoral communities in the Horn of Africa, we are implementing a project for the countries, 4 countries in the Horn of Africa, that provides savings and insurance protection to the pastoralists. In just 2 years, we've been able to reach over 2.5 million people and raise over $200 million in private capital in terms of capacity. I mean, I won't go into the agriculture and what we are doing around the smallholder farmers, but what are we learning? We are learning that indeed it is a public-private sector agenda. Once you bring in a public fund, so like in the DRIVE project, for the $70 million or so that have come into this, we're able to raise 200 million. So we're able to do 3 or even 4 times more. So the de-risking is happening. We are coming together as agents of change. That's really what I'm saying. We are moving further down to make sure that we're including. And I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the transformation that can be brought, is coming, but it's also can be unleashed by the digital payment transformation that is happening. Today, we've seen what M-Pesa has done in Kenya. But can we do that at a continental level? Can we actually, because insurance cannot happen, financing can't happen to the smallholder people, the guys that are on cross-border trading at border posts, unless we are able to solve that problem. And on ZEPRI's side, we have engaged regulators. So we engage regulators. We have a 9-year regulator forum, actually. We decided if insurance was going to change, we needed to bring the policy makers in the room. In about 2 weeks' time, we'll have another one. And things are changing about microinsurance regulations. So I would maybe challenge us also to make sure that we get the digital payment clear and supportive if we are going to achieve the FCFTA. Yeah, so thank you very much. And so insurance is doing its work. We can do much better for sure.
We can do a lot more. All right. We'll have a few minutes for Q&A, so please write your questions. We'll have at least 2 or 3 questions from the audience. Admasu, let me come to you. Last year, we've seen you coming to the market to get some bit of financing. We saw $100 million facility from the UK's British International Investment, Islamic Trade Finance Corporation. There's a lot of money that has come in, and it's extremely layered. But when we get into the alliance, there is also the conversation on how do you separate priority within your organization and priority within the alliance, priority within country to country. Just help us reconcile what that looks like.
Good evening, everybody. Very pleased to be here, and all protocols observed. I'll follow the AU. Just maybe to say, I don't think institutions very explicitly try to prioritize in that way. I think institutions end up being very practical. You do what you are able to do given, what's coming through the market, right? We supply finance, we supply solutions, and that's on the back of demand. I think really what's really exciting these days, I think for the audience and for all of us is, we heard from the commissioner what the theme is here. We're here about, rethinking architecture. And we are here on the very early stages of the birthplace of AAMFI, right? We're trying to do business differently. That is a very key aspect of what brings us all here together. Money we all raise. The BII, the various facilities you've mentioned, that's sort of everyday business. We're always raising money. I can show you 20 press releases of different funding that I've raised, and I think all my colleagues do that too. I think what we're trying to address now is a new imperative of trying to synergize together, because we've all been successful. If you look at the balance sheets of the individual institutions on the panel here, AfriX, and we've all been very successful. Equity Bank is quite a success story itself, very prominent here on not just the Kenyan landscape, now becoming a regional bank. I think what's very new these days is all of us are trying to find ways to leverage on one another. And if you were to ask me, what strikes you in the context of what Commissioner Mchanga said, I would say to you, a lot of the very impactful deals that we've done as TDB, we've not done them alone. In almost every single case, there have been partnerships with the institutions on this panel, but of course African Development Bank as well. Just give an example of the famous Turkana wind power project. 300 megawatts, often celebrated, one of the first very large wind farm power projects. Everybody talks about it today as a landmark project. Not everybody knows how difficult it was for that project to get off the ground. And the true story is the only reason that project got off the ground is because 3 African multilaterals came together, brainstormed in the face of exits that took place at the very final stages of that project, which would have caused the project never to take off. And the reason we all got together and pulled up our sleeves is one of the big entities called me up and said, you've got to put more on the table because somebody just walked away. And he says, it's not just debt funding, I need you to put equity on the table because that's the only way we're going to get this project off the ground. And it was a number of us who came together and coughed up that additional capital. And it's not conventional for lending institutions to put equity on the table easily, right? Now, today we all sit back and enjoy the success of Turkana Wind, many others coming on the back of that. But the lesson from that particular experience of ours here in Kenya was that wouldn't have succeeded if African institutions didn't come together and say, we're going to plug the gap. Not everybody thinks it's feasible. It's okay. We're all entitled to our opinions. But some of us believe it's feasible. And those of us who believe are going to put more skin in the game and make it happen. Today, it's a success story. I'm sure there's many other stories like that. When I think of the cement story that Samaila mentioned here, I was just, saying, wow, I've done about 7-8 cement projects the past 10, 15 years. And in every single case, there's either AFC in the picture or DBSA, or mostly it's been with AFC. We've done it in the DR Congo, the first major cement plant, a huge country that didn't have a significant cement plant. We did deals together in Uganda. We've done deals. And if you look across the whole spectrum, you'll find that this is an age where we're coming together in ways that we don't always fully realize. This is it's a new era. If you go back 20, 30 years ago, you wouldn't find these kinds of stories where very significant landmark and big industrial projects were getting off the ground as a result of African financial institutions backing those projects. And I can tell you there's many, many others that I can refer to today here. I don't have the time to do that. But I just thought, since you have the AAMFI logo here and we're all members and very passionate about the cause, I think people should realize that there's a lot that's happened in the past 10 to 20 years where we are working together very smartly in ways that's not obvious. You'll only see the press releases. You'll see our balance sheets and our annual reports. You'll see our successes. But nobody reports on the in-betweens, right? So it's not very visible how much I've done with IFC, how much I've done with Afrexim, how much I do with ATD, how much I do with ZEPRI. There's so much there to be told. The only question now is how can we structure it better, but through an alliance like this, through the Africa Investment Forum. The Africa Investment Forum is another mechanism that we're all using to say, how can we get difficult projects that are on the priority list of NEPAD, the AU, onto a platform where African institutions can say, this thing has been frozen for too long. It's not moving, this project. What can we do together to put a little bit of wind in those sails? It's a ship that is frozen, right? And again, these are the kinds of new thinking that's going on. So it's not business as usual. And I just thought I would take the few minutes that you've given me to share with everybody why there's this new excitement around AAMFI, African Investment Forum. There's also one on continental trade. We're trying to do things differently. Why? Because Africa has realized if we don't integrate and create scale amongst ourselves, we'll always be condemned to being so much less relevant on multiple levels. you inspired me in the first few minutes of our chat this evening, so I had to say these few words. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll get the Atidi and Shelter Afrique perspective, but Dr. Mwangi, let's hear from you. You've been at the forefront of the SME support conversation, innovative financing, you name it. As much as has been said about the progress that we've made, some basics still remain. We're still trading predominantly in cash. When we go from one border to another, the merchants, there's still a bit of a problem. So maybe you could just help us understand, as we continue to map out the structure and roadmap, where do we get it wrong as local finance institutions when we're talking about trade finance?
Thank you very much. One, let me appreciate the gathering today, but more importantly, the coming up together of the club, simply because they will now hold each other to account, and they will syndicate their balance sheet, and Africa will have a significant balance sheet if they pull together. They can pull any project through. I hope you will not leave us to get behind, and that my presence on this table is an invitation of the commercial banks to work with you. Now, SMEs have had significant challenges, and SMEs are the greatest opportunity on the African continent. They represent the face of the African entrepreneur. They represent the African capital. It has been described how successful Equity is. It's because it focused on SMEs. 30 years ago, Equity was number 66 in this country. Today, Equity is arguably number one or number two largest bank in Eastern Central Africa, simply because 72% of our balance sheet plays on the SME. Where have we got it right? And maybe lessons can be learned. I think the first one is to appreciate that it truly, if we want to have impact, this is the area. We didn't focus on SME because it is easy. SMEs are not easy, but it's simply because we wanted to see impact. We wanted to be associated with impact. Now, the challenges with SMEs is lack of reference and history. If you look at the SMEs and talk of any on the African continent, they are the first generation of African businesses. They have no reference. They have no history to learn from. So they are learning as they go. And what we see most is the mistakes that they have made. The second one is lack of support. If you look in the past, this conversation would not be here. The multilateral will only talk about public sector financing. Financing roads, financing power, financing education, and it was neglected that to complete the equation of an economy, you need the public and private sector to work together. So there was a complete disconnect with the financial system on the African continent in terms of access to finance. Essentially, what that bred is the disconnect, where you do massive investment in infrastructure, but there is no private sector to utilize that infrastructure. So you end up with this, the Kenyan standard gauge railway, but it can't pay itself because the private sector is not producing goods and services to be exported. You get the roads, but there are no cars because the private sector are only buying private cars. There are no lorries to transport goods to the marketplace. So essentially, we are not sweating the infrastructure. So that's where we got it wrong first. The second one is we adopted the global financing models, where we asked, give me your data. Now, startups have no data to give. So if you start that way, then there is no financing that will ever flow to the private sector. The second one, we asked them, tell us more about securities. African culture didn't allow women to hold RAD, for instance, particularly in Kenya. Yet when you come to Equity, 54% of the customers are women. So it was complete chaos. Systemic chaos, if I may say. So we didn't see that perspective and address it. Today, African Guarantee Fund has come and said, they don't need to have security. Why don't you buy a guarantee for them and lend them? The second one is the substitution of data and history with financial literacy. Those who really understand equity know equity succeeded because of rolling out financial and entrepreneurship training. We have trained 3.8 million peasant farmers and converted them into agribusinesses. Once they become agribusinesses, you have a view of a cash flow from the marketplace. The latest one is Young Africa Work. When COVID struck, we said, here we are stuck with a problem. Why don't we digitize training for young people, young entrepreneurs? They have gone to school, they can learn on the platform. After 2 years, we had funded 600,000 micro, small entrepreneurs who had gone through the training. Their default rate is 4% compared with the country's industry average of 15%. Why? Because we embarked on training them. They became aware. They knew what they were doing. They could negotiate better. They could understand the market better. That has been the biggest problem in Africa. Thinking finance is a panacea for the SMEs. We need to bring financial knowledge, financial literacy, awareness to that sector so that it becomes much bankable. Let me stop there because of time.
Perfect, thank you. Manuel, right next. We'd like to discuss about a TD and providing critical political risk insurance, particularly for investments in Africa. Maybe you could just specifically, without speaking much, just provide a situation where your risk mitigation has enabled a major private sector to thrive in an area that would have been maybe too risky.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. It's a pleasure and an honor to be amongst such distinguished ladies and gentlemen. Really, I think political risk, since you've directed me in that direction, I would talk about it first, but I also want to talk about SMEs, since I had this conversation with James maybe 20 years ago, how to crack the SME story, but I can share a bit of that success. But let's come back to political risk. As you know, all our governments, and Commissioner Mchanga will also know this, have been trying to enable infrastructure to happen. They put all the laws, they put all the regulations, and they think now private sector would come. But they were surprised that they've done all the reforms. Why is the private sector not responding? And this is the critical part. When investors, when you talk to them, they will tell you, I like the laws, I like the regulations, but I'm not sure they've been tested. Yeah? What really happens when I've put my money out there, won't they change? As you know, right now in Africa, we are running, I think, 19 or 18 elections this year alone. So there's going to be some changes. And once we have a change, there could be some different perspective of how those regulations, were they fair to the private sector, were they unfair, was that a raw deal for the government, etc., etc. So investors are always wary of this issue. And there was a need, actually, to create what we would call a political risk insurer. Basically along the same lines as MIGA, which you know, on the World Bank group, but a MIGA for Africa. That's really who we are, to try and actually make those projects work. So Tadesse mentioned the Turkana, which I will not mention because we're involved, but there's also a second project right here in Kenya, Kipeto. I don't know if you know about it. That's the second largest wind project in Africa. It also happens to be in Kenya. I don't know how, but Kenya is really ahead. Again, in that project, there was this question of what happens to the tariff. If you read the newspapers in Kenya, they are saying, oh, electricity is expensive. If you talk to investors, they say, this is a risk that the tariff might be revised downwards. And therefore, my entire cash flow, my entire modeling changes. I need someone to guarantee me that indeed the tariff that I had negotiated under my power purchase agreement would hold for the life of the PPA. So yes, that's one example of where we have given our instruments and our tools to actually make that investment happen. And it's a success. This electricity maybe is coming from those two projects that we are using right now, from wind. And if you look at Kenya, 70% or so is from green sources. So really, these are the tools that we have been deploying. And we would like, of course, working with all the partners here. I've got my shareholders here, I've got my partners here, to actually replicate this concept across the continent, to do the big infrastructure projects. But that it doesn't stop there. And James mentioned it, that it's not important, it's not enough to create only the big infrastructure. You must then deal with the actual face of Africa's enterprise. That discussion cannot happen without SMEs. This is the majority of our SMEs. He is here as a banker, and he will tell you they are tricky. He did mention here, SMEs are tricky. How do you help him overcome his credit committees and risk committees to then say, I want to deploy the balance sheet to SMEs? Somebody needs to come in with some of the instruments we provide. So we also stand between the bank and the SMEs, just along the same lines like the Africa Guarantee Fund does, to say how can we de-risk the banks so they can continue to do more of what they're doing in this SME space, because that is the future of the continent. If those SMEs don't become corporates, we are doomed. They have to grow. They have to become the next, Amazons, the next Googles in Africa, because look, we have a continent of 1.5 billion people. We are organizing ourselves under the African Union in this Africa continental free trade area. Just imagine the potential of what we are creating here. Really, we are mimicking China on steroids if we can organize ourselves, because really the potential is here, the resources are here. How can we trade amongst ourselves? Again, we have instruments around that to say, how do you de-risk trade within intra-Africa? When you look at the statistics, and Commissioner Mchanga might correct me, intra-African trade in Africa is maybe 16%. When you look at other regional blocks, they are at 60-70%. Why? Because Africans don't trade with each other. And again, we want to sit between the two traders and say, listen, don't mind, sell your goods to this other buyer in Senegal who you've never met, because we have assessed that buyer on your behalf, and we can give you the guarantee that should that buyer not pay you, we'll come in and pay you out, so that you can now actually trade some more. These are some of the tools that we're doing. You can call it political risk or credit risk, but there's a risk involved, and somebody needs to manage it. It's either a perception or reality, but usually perception is reality.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. All right. Mr. Han, we saved the best question for last. So the basics, right? So aside from what the different institutions are doing, you have rapidly growing cities, urbanization coming, everyone's now trying to get their foot through the door, and everyone holding hands and saying, okay, let's go. And then the basics are affected. All of a sudden you wake up and there are floods. Housing, basics. So how do you manage progress vis-a-vis things that come as unpredicted as that? Just talk to us about that, and then we'll jump into one or two questions.
My neighbor is saying get insurance. So I'm trying to sell her product here. But it's a pleasure to be here, really, among very reputable institutions and all protocols observed as well. Thank you, Ambassador Muchanga, for really honoring your presence in this room, and our president of AAMFI, Professor Rama, and all distinguished colleagues on this panel. So my name is Chelma Biban. I'm the CEO of Shell to Afrique Development Bank, which transformed into a development bank since end of last year, October. So we are in the process of growing and actually playing a much bigger role than we've played in the last 42 years at Shell to Afrique Development Bank. So I think the reason why we're all here today is very much historical. I really would like everybody to notice having all these African institutions on stage, and the African Union also shepherding this whole effort, because this panel and actually the alliance was launched at the summit of the heads of states in Addis Ababa. So I think this is very historical. It's a historical moment that we can all come together to work as one team to strengthen our capital and be able to deliver more for our people and have more impact across the continent. So we have different sectors and different products that we're offering, but we are all complementary. So what you're just referring to about urbanization and the crisis in many of our cities, where we're sitting here today in Kenya, in Nairobi, we had major floods that have affected many of our neighbors, citizens. Shelter Africa is headquartered here in Nairobi. We have regional offices in West Africa as well, in Abidjan and Nigeria. But we've been experiencing this climate change actually firsthand here in Nairobi. Some of our staff were been affected as well. So we can tell you that urbanization is real and climate change is also real. Shelter Africa looks at the housing deficit as a major opportunity for investment as well, for institutions like ours on this panel, but also for the private sector as a whole. And we are supposed to be enablers as development banks to really help our private sector thrive. And this is exactly what we've been doing at Shelter Africa. Over the past 42 years of existence, we've been actually taking chances on entrepreneurs, looking at two main things, right? We're looking at the character of the investor, of the private sector, and the passion to actually do what they're doing. I just came back from Washington, D.C., where I was with the Kenyan delegation, meeting many private sector and the White House with President Ruto and delegation. And one of our clients that we financed in 2005 just raised $200 million with DFC. And this is to tell you that to be able for Africa to be able to create unicorns, we really need to invest early stage. We really need to believe in those names that we are working with every day. We can have some unicorns in the room, right? So we need to really give it a chance. So this institution is financing affordable student housing, and they're pretty big in Kenya. We were the first one to finance them in 2005 when nobody believed in them. And it was very emotional when the founder actually mentioned this at the White House in front of all the delegates, and mentioning that Shelter Africa was the first to finance them. And they never forgot that. And this is really taking them to where they are today. So it's just really to say that it's possible to create unicorns and institutions that can have a global footprint. And this is exactly what we're doing. So Africa today has 52 million housing deficit. So if you estimate at a very conservative price for a housing unit, you get an investment need of about $1.4 trillion. $1.4 trillion are needed to resolve the mere deficit we have today. Now, that deficit is growing every year, right? So everybody in this room has at least been building a home or buying a home or taking a mortgage. You know, housing creates jobs. So we're in the business of creating jobs and creating wealth for our nations. And the way we do it is through housing and urban development. Housing is at the center of development in many developed countries. In the US, real estate represents more than 52% of wealth in the economy. So I think it's really important for us to also invest in the space and do risking instruments with my sister here and my brother at TD, I think are really critical, because when we lend into the sector, the first risk that the financial institutions in the different countries that we're funding, they raise basically is the fact that developers are not strong enough, or consumers don't have the capacity to actually afford, right, the mortgages. So what we do, we develop some credit enhancement instruments or guarantee structures, just like we've done in Nigeria, where we have actually issued a bond in the capital markets. We had an MTN, medium-term note program, of 200 billion nairas. We issued the first tranche of 46 billion nairas, which was actually 60% oversubscribed. This was in 2022. And you know, today we're looking to do more of those kind of issuances in the different countries. And this funding allows us to actually finance not only financial institutions in the different countries, but also developers to actually deploy in the economy. And by doing that, they're also funding SMEs, right, in the value chain, in the housing value chain. So the way we look at housing is not just about the four walls, it's really about the full value chain. It creates jobs, it creates wealth. When somebody has a home, right? They have a dignity, but they can also even raise money, through the banks to finance their businesses, right? It can be a collateral for that. So at Shelter Afrique, we have 4 main businesses that focuses on exactly that. So we finance banks, we finance developers, we finance PPPs with governments, and we have a fund management group where we have concessional funding for thematic areas, looking at green climate resilience, gender, housing for women, and women in the housing value chain. We finance trade and SMEs in the housing value chain through the banks. We have a product for Islamic finance, working with the Gulf banks, and also we finance infrastructure, social infrastructure to de-risk the housing sector, and then migrant and refugee housing. This is really about job creation, because when you can have large-scale housing programs, we can really skill up the youth in the countries, get them to work, actually. You need plumbers, electricians, across the value chain. So you create jobs and resolve the housing crisis. And then the diaspora is also another area where we're looking to help our countries get to hard currency. And we're doing that by creating diaspora funds, right, to really address that. So just in a nutshell, I would say that housing, SMEs are very much linked, and resilience with all the catastrophes that we're seeing across the continent is really critical for us to think about really climate change and financing our programs with those kind of instruments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. For the interest of time, we can't cover this in less than an hour, so we really appreciate your time. We'll have to close it here. What we're keen on the audience knowing is that there is a strategy to empower private sector to champion economic development, and we have the actors, but we beseech everyone. Yeah? Are we good with questions? Yeah? Perfect. All right. 1, 2, 3.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lebon from Green Max Capital Fund. And throughout this session, I realized that AAMFI takes pride into collaboration. And my question tackles the area of impact and sustainability. And it's the following. How will the Alliance measure the impact of the initiatives on job creation and on more broad economic development in Africa?
Assessing impact, okay. There's
Good evening, everyone. My name is Papa Cham, Value Chain Development Switzerland of Africa. Having heard all of you speaking, we realize we have different products, different institutions, different needs, and different availabilities. And above all, you have the ability to use your seed money to raise more money. So if I hear you well, that means we are facing a crisis of economic opportunities, where you will put your money the right way in order to leverage it. So, assuming that investment, finance, and growth are irremediably cluster issues, that means that you need to blend your investment along value chains that may converge into clusters. So assuming now, I just look at the spectrum here, and then you take a model of saying, okay, you were going to go and build an agro-based industrial multiple growth center that could develop into a urban development. So just to encapsulate everything. So you are saying that you need to sit down. I would say, okay, no. Before you sit down, maybe you need to have a strategy that's going to all bring you along, that highlight near-term investment opportunities for you all, and blend and syndicate the investment and make it happen. Assuming you run into the expertise that can do that. As institutions may be working on silos for the time being, how would you engage with that expertise and get you help achieve this goal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Where is she? Where? There. Please. Yeah.
My name is Benedicta Lassie. I'm from Ghana and from the African Trade Chamber. First, I would like to thank Mr. James, for your comments on SMEs. I think you addressed all the issues, and we must begin to see AAMFI supporting commercial banks so that you can also support SMEs. My main question goes to AFC. I think I've been following your work for some time now, and as a private sector-led business, you've done extremely well, and I think the entire continent is proud of you in your ability to attract capital onto the market. My question is, we have a lot of private project promoters. Now, we know that the time where our government could give sovereign guarantees are over. And so you need a private sector to step in to support and participate in infrastructure development. However, we also know that private sector getting projects to bankability is very difficult. And so pre-feasibility studies, the funding of that entire process is a challenge. AFDB has put in place the African Legal Fund facility to support in project preparation. I think Afri-Exim Bank also has a fund. But for private sector who take an initiative that they want to go into a PPP with government to sort of develop a project, how do we support private sector in the phases of development of these projects to ensure that we do not have the private sector as one that feels not being part of the entire conversation on infrastructure development, but we acknowledging that we need private sector to support public sector in providing the necessary infrastructure. And as AFC has shown, yes, the money is there, the capital can be raised, but how do we now move our various projects from the projects being on paper to bankability and to give the investors comfort? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe you could answer that first, and then we'll tackle the other two questions.
Thank you very much. So we have actually focused on project development, what we call developing to de-risk, as our main offering. And we have several examples of that. So in Ghana, the SenPower project is one of our first, and it's of course the first independent power project in the country. So it meant working with the government to create the enabling environment, and we've replicated that in Cape Verde, Djibouti, several other places. So it's something that we do, and we're open, to participate. We actually have a very elaborate process for that. We're currently now working with the government of the US, the EU, Angola, DRC, and Zambia, as well as the AFDB to develop the Lobito corridor. So it's something that we do, and we're constantly doing. Let me take a quick stab at this question on impact that was raised. So, of course, everybody can chime in as well. I think that's a very, very good question. I think for us, impact will be how we can deepen the partnership that we have, how much more capital that we can mobilize, what kind of, I would say, what kind of institutions that we can cause to be created. So for example, Ambassador Muchanga mentioned the African capital market. That's an initiative that's dear to all of us, because all of us as the development finance institution know that our real job is to take risks, and to take the risk that most other people can't. So that is an initiative that we would like to assume and try to see how we can drive that. More importantly, we also want to be able to educate our leaders on typical development trajectory across the globe, and how we can't do something different and expect different outcomes. So it's very important for us to be deliberate around how we can collectively mobilize savings. So our colleagues talked about insurance and pensions and the need for de-risking. So we need to be able to focus on domestic capital mobilization. So how much domestic capital we can mobilize is part of how we're going to demonstrate impact. Then how much of transitioning of the African potential to reality that we cause to happen is also part of that. I'll give you an example. So Africa, Guinea in particular, is one of the largest bauxite producers in the world. So is Australia. Both of them are exporting about 100 million tons of bauxite every year. But Guinea is not getting nearly half of what Australia gets. Why? Because Australia is not just exporting bauxite, it's transforming it to alumina and to aluminium. So it is capturing far more value from its bauxite than Guinea is doing. So we, as the Africa Club, will need to look at what are the lower hanging fruits for the structural transformation that we say needs to happen on our continent. We have significant high-grade iron ore. And we know that with high-grade iron ore, you don't need as much energy. So how are we building the energy systems that will allow us to beneficiate iron ore? We know that going into the future, copper is going to be the most important mineral, and we have significant of it in Africa. How are we building the energy systems that allow us to transform that copper into copper oxide, into anode, cathode, going forward is part of how we demonstrate impact on the continent. And to the point raised by James, we need to find a way to connect, the physical infrastructure, the big infrastructure we build with the actual needs of the community. We need to find traffic for the infrastructure that we build. And that goes to the point that our sister raised from Ghana. How are we supporting SMEs? And we support them by advancing funds to banks. And we have a very broad program for that. All of us here together are working together to provide funding to financial institutions.
Right. Let's pass the microphone to Admasu. There was a question here that was asked on a crisis where we have a lot of money, but we don't know where to put it the right way. And there was the scenario that was given about the agro-based industrial strategy, how to engage with other players in the space to also make sure that they offer that expertise. Please just take a stab at that, and then we'll take the last round of questions. Yeah.
I'm going to be a bit boring on this. Nothing very exciting to say, only to point out that you'd be pleased, I think, to learn that there are many of us who are pushing industrial parks, agro-processing zones, export processing zones. I know Afrexim is very busy in that area. And so it is an area that's receiving a great deal of attention. So I think suffice to say it's not being ignored or neglected in any particular way. I think there's a very strong understanding now that the one way of dealing with some of our debt sustainability issues is to really deal with exports. We have to get organized to do better exports and improve the value of that export as well. It's on our radar screens. Everybody's working on it. The African Union also has several initiatives pushing this, so rest assured it's getting all the attention it deserves.
Hope?
Right. Just to echo my colleagues, that really AAMFI is about owning our problems, right? Trying to find solutions to our African problems. So when you think about, indeed talking about the agro value chain, and how we are all interconnected. So the project I did talk about where we're de-risking pastures in the Horn of Africa, actually to de-risk them, to connect them to markets, right? Because unless you have groups of productive pastures, right, everybody is all over. But once we've brought on board, and by the way, we're using equity bank accounts to get them into the financial cycle, we're getting them to save. And then we're saying, guys, we actually have 300,000 pasturists. They are organized in 10 groups. They can sell millions of cattle. And then it does give the people building, like Arise and others, and TDB, that are investing now in the value, in the production, right? The livestock value chains, whether it is milk, whether it is it's meat, whether it is sale of live animals. Just to know that Qatar needed about 3 million heads of cattle. We were not organized enough to sell them for the World Cup. So how do we actually bring the whole chain together? And I think that is what AAMFI is doing, but is going to do much better. just also to appreciate the African Development Bank. It is really the engine that powers all of us. If you think about, nearly all of us have FDB as an anchor shareholder, as board members, as funders, and we'll do them proud by coming together also to do better and to do more. Thank you.
Thank you. I saw a hand from someone representing SMEs. Please. Please make it as punchy as possible.
Thank you. This was a really insightful session. My question is directed to Mr. James, and I wanted to ask, when it comes to partnerships with the private sector and also financing, how do we make sure we prioritize capacity building, especially access to knowledge for the grassroots entrepreneurs and also SME and MSME owners, so that we can have access to learning on how to do businesses better, how to access these funding opportunities, how to make sure we are at the table when it comes to public participation, even with policy making, how to make sure we access the right markets, so that when all these funding opportunities get to us, who are the grassroots entrepreneurs, we don't have a situation where we don't know what to do with the funding. When it gets to us, we are ready to improve our innovations, we are ready to increase our revenues, and we are ready to actually contribute to economic growth. So how do we make sure we prioritize access to knowledge and capacity building with all these partnerships and the financing options?
Fantastic, fantastic. Dr. James, we'll come to you. There was a question there. We don't want to leave you out, please. Then you'll be the last ones. All right. Oh.
Thank you so much for this session. So I have one question. It goes to Mr. Samaria Zubeiru. So you mentioned earlier, you talked about the Asian miracle. So I would like to ask, how feasible is this miracle within the African context? And what are the possible, what are the drawbacks? Why haven't we gotten to that level yet? Thank you.
Thank you. Very clear. 1-1. Then we'll be done. Yeah. Right there, right there.
Good evening. My name is Elisha Chesiro from the National Treasury. So this has been a very insightful conversation. Thank you, Georgie, for the chance. I have a very quick question with regard to how we look at the nexus between this kind of financing and taxation, which has become a very active conversation. So considering the varying tax policies we have across African countries, how would you all quickly recommend innovative tax reforms that we implement so that we create a balance between resource mobilization and private investment while still ensuring equitable economic development? Yeah, thanks.
Perfect. Thank you. Don't back out on me now. I know the tax conversation. Okay. Let's have one last one.
All right, good evening. First of all, thank you very much for such an amazing panel, and also special greetings to Mr. Mwangi, with whom I met in New York not too long ago. My conversation is about diaspora investments, right? So I run Bridge Partners, and what Bridge Partners does is that we specialize on mobilizing and aggregating diaspora investments, private retail investments to co-invest with DFIs like yourself into infrastructure, renewable energy, and financial institutions. Mr. Han already spoke about the potency of diaspora investments for, indeed, development in Africa. But my question is to also the other panelists. What is your consideration with regards to the diaspora and its potency as a real source of financing? And what is your plan to harness this potential? Thank you.
Thank you. You had touched on that, huh? A bit on the diaspora. All right. So we'll start off with the question to Dr. James on access to learning for grassroots entrepreneurs.
Thank you very much. I think there is significant empirical data at the moment that shows the importance of financial literacy and empowerment. Let's call it capacitation. The benefit of capacitation is de-risking. So there is a complete alignment. When, for instance, we train, we spend money in training, we see the reward in lower NPLs or non-performing loan books. So the reward is instant. I think what is critical is the collaboration and partnerships. If there is alignment completely, then it becomes a market practice. The problem at the moment, it's not a market practice. There are some who are distorting the market, and particularly when government comes in. And when government comes in, it then distorts the market, make it so easy, and then people are saying, why are you insisting I train? But I think as we train on that capacity, I think the biggest training that needs to happen in SMEs in Africa is the concept of savings. We can keep on talking about financing, but financing is related directly to savings. The investment that SMEs make need not necessarily be completely debt-oriented. It is a combination of saving by the SMEs, it becomes a pool of investment, then they leverage on debt so that it's a balanced financing model. So that is where we have a real big problem, and that is where I guess our focus on training SMEs should be about savings, which then they can convert into investments and then leverage with the debt. Thank you.
Right, and please, I beseech all of you on the panel, please, let's not get into that cycle where we do 6 months training, 6 months workshops, take you around the world, take you everywhere, and then we underinvest. So please, overtraining is also something that is hampering our growth as SMEs or young people within the space. Samaria, there was a question on feasibility of achieving the dream.
Thank you very much. So clearly very feasible. Why? Because we see, pockets of progress across the continent. And what we need now is more concerted action around value capture, value retention as the bedrock that would create the quality jobs and the incomes that would be the foundation for the savings, which you all know is very critical. And we need to, again, but this time around, because I don't want us to kind of learn from our mistakes, and because we have seen this done before, we need to workshop specifically as AAMFI, the best route for us to be able to move, from where we are today to where we ought to go, based on all the successful precedents that has happened. But there are basic models. The basic model is, value capture, value retention, import substitution, export-led growth, industrialization of the economy, education, jobs. That's really the foundation. Then the savings, providing de-risking tools, for pensions, insurance, creating, frameworks for asset allocation that would actually encourage growth. So, for example, pension funds, need to have asset allocation for venture, for private equity, infrastructure funds, infrastructure private equity, real estate, and then, of course, government debt and co. Why? Because if the likes of Microsoft, Apple did not have venture from pension funds, in whatever percentage, they will not exist today. So we must have an eye on the future, and we must take calculated risks, around investing in the future. So some of those reforms are necessary, and then we need to find a way for governments, to understand that the savings that come from these initial initiatives, successes, will need to be reinvested into higher value industries. And that's what was done. And then, of course, like I mentioned, we need to create the markets. We need to create the stock exchanges that are able to mobilize the savings, that are able to provide the de-risking tools. We need to create all of those things. Of course, we need to focus on the research. We need to make investments in the energy systems. We need to make the investments in the ports, in the rail, and the roads, and all of that infrastructure that is required. We need to make that investment. Again, all of that is already ongoing. It's just how to harness it in a different way, how to look at specific value chains, specific ecosystems, and we've done the same. So we've built, the forestry value chain with our RIs in Gabon. It has made the country move from exporting raw logs of wood to furniture, veneer, plywood, soilwood, one of the largest exporters of furniture today. We're doing the same in Benin Republic with cotton and cashew, sesame, soya. We're doing the same with livestock in Chad. We're actually doing the continental free trade area as continental free trade as part of that initiative. So there are many things that we've done that demonstrate this is possible. We just need to do them at scale.
Perfect. So we have about 2 minutes, and we need to wrap it up. Maybe we could talk about the diaspora. Since you touched on it a bit, we could just touch on that, and considerations as we plan to rally their support and financial backing.
No, thank you very much. I just want to say first, because since I was listening to my fellow panelists, I really think that partnership is key in everything that we're doing, right? It's about partnership between governments, private sector, and DFI, development finance institutions like us here, and international ones. That's how we can really scale up and address the investment needs that we have. I was mentioning only housing, $1.4 trillion. Now you talk about all other sectors. Africa is a $3 trillion market, okay? So we cannot tap into that until we come together. So that's why I think we're here. This is right at the beginning of it. Now, coming to diaspora, every year you have about $95 billion of diaspora remittances coming to Africa, okay? Every year, $95 billion. Those are the estimates that are known. Now, you have funding coming through informal sector, etc., that we don't know. So the question is, how can we harness this diaspora, remittances within our countries across the continent, right? And this is growing every year, by the way. So I think it's really critical to create platforms, structures to capture these remittances into productive areas, because today it's very difficult to account for where is this money going, right? A lot of it is just for consumption, consumers, etc. So the question is, how can we use this money in productive areas? And frankly, housing, real estate, value chain are all productive areas, or agri and other sectors as well. So I think from our perspective, at least at Shelter Afrique Development Bank, the idea is to create platforms where we can harness the diaspora funding through this platform. We know the developers across the 54 countries where we can work on the continent. We have 44 shareholders among those 54, and we know where we can actually invest and make investment returns for the diaspora that's looking to invest, but some of them just want to have access to those houses. So we want to develop such platforms to harness this diaspora funding. And this can be done across every single sector that we are looking at. Because I think in this macro environment where all our countries need hard currency, right, to stop this hemorrhage of currency depreciation, I think it's important to harness this diaspora funding. But also on the other side, we have money in Africa. It's about knowing how to aggregate and go after this money. I mean, the pension funds that my brother Smaila was talking about, they're sitting on pile of cash they have to allocate, right? But they're not able to allocate because you don't have enough investment opportunities. So it's up to us to create those vehicles and to get this kind of funding into the space of development and investment impact. And this is exactly what we're doing by raising local currency bonds. In Nigeria, I was giving an example of the 200 billion naira program we have, but many other countries in the CFA zone, we've done it. In Kenya, shilling, we've done it. So this is kind of like engagement we can do. And we can do it also as a platform, as AAMFI. So we'll be looking forward to such conversations. Thanks.
Perfect. And I'm almost 100% certain every organization represented here has a platform that can at least utilize most of the money coming from outside. Let's get to the last question, most interesting for today. Recommending tax reforms. I don't know who's going to take that one. There we go. For balance between capital building and fair treatment of the tax base, the people that are paying the tax. And please, we're speaking on behalf of taxpayers, also outside these walls.
My driver is waiting for me right here. I'm going to run away as soon as I say what I say. Well, look, I think the truth is tax administration is not really the forte of financial institutions and so on. But the one thing that I think is clear is in the land where M-Pesa was born, digitization would appear to me to be the greatest promise and potential for getting the net very efficiently spread out and positioning the coffers of state to be efficiently filled over the years to come. Because I think the hardest part of administering tax in Africa has to do with the people factor. And I think if you can digitize and move away from the human interface as much as possible, I think it would perhaps lead to the greatest results.
Is that our final word on tax? Dr. James, we'll be left with you here in Kenya. Talk to us about tax. I can't let you go.
Very delicate issue, balancing, financing the needs of the citizens and getting money from the citizens in form of tax. But I think the issue is, how do you spur an economy, and particularly the private sector, using tax? Tax can be an incentive or a punitive tool. So essentially, I think it's more of balancing. What do you want to achieve? And how do you use the tax to signal, particularly the signaling effect? There's no difference between the physical sector, but I don't think the pressure to raise money sometimes bribes the taxman not to remember that this is a signaling effect, how the economy and particularly the private sector will respond to the tax net. I think I've said what I had to say.
Let me tell you.
But I don't have the driver here, because even if I have a driver here, tomorrow I will still come.
It's a very touchy subject, you can tell, but we all, I'm 100% certain, we agree that the solution might not be to overtax, is to widen the tax base, as we've been saying. So let's have that top of mind. All right, so hopefully we'll have the same conversation a year from now. It's all been recorded, so whatever you've said, if you've not worked on it, we'll have something to go back on. But please allow us to give a warm round of applause to the panelists. Also for requesting for more time to actually answer the questions, so we appreciate that very much. Professor Rama, Ambassador Muchanga, please join us on stage. We'd like to take a final picture, and then we'll wrap up for today. Thank you, everyone.
I think you deserve a round of applause for staying so late as well, yeah? Thank you so much for the passion.